Order. The Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee is now in session, and it is our first session, the first session of the Select Committee of this new Parliament. So I'm very pleased and happy to welcome everybody here, and particularly I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Today we are conducting a one-off evidence session to scrutinise the new budget, the first budget of the new government, which was elected, as we know, on a platform of change and with a mission to grow the economy. With the help of our expert witnesses, we are seeking to assess the impact of the budget on UK science, innovation and technology, consider what the budget reveals about the government's ambitions for the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, where science spend is being directed, how the success of that spend can be measured, and whether the budget represents change for the department and the sector more broadly. So let me welcome our first panel of witnesses. We're joined by Professor Adrian Smith, President of the Royal Society, Professor Dame Karen Holford, Chief Executive and Vice-Chancellor of Cranfield University and University's UK Board Member, and Professor Richard Jones, Vice President for Regional Innovation and Civic Engagement at the University of Manchester. And I shall ask each witness to introduce themselves before we move on to questions. And I should have said Professor Sir Adrian Smith, if you could introduce yourself first.
Well, you've just introduced me. I'm Adrian Smith. I'm currently the President of the Royal Society. I have a background, 30 years as a jobbing academic, 16 years trying to run universities, and for my sins, 4 years in government as Director General for Science and Research during the period 2008 to 12, and I think my first day was when the world financial system collapsed.
That's an auspicious beginning. Dame Karen Halford.
Nice to meet you all. Karen Holford. I'm an engineer by background. I've been Vice-Chancellor at Cranfield University for the last 3 years. Cranfield is a specialist, a world-leading specialist institution, postgraduate-only university, specialising in STEM and business and management. And of course, I am representing the Universities UK. Prior to my post at Cranfield University, I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Cardiff University, and my whole career I've spent working with industry as an academic who does experimental work and so on. So very much my whole focus really has been the industry academic partnership world.
Thank you, Dame Karen. And as an engineer myself, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the session. And Professor Richard Jones.
So I'm Richard Jones. I'm an experimental physicist by training. I've taken an interest in innovation policy, particularly over the last few years. I work with the University of Manchester, where I look after the relationship between the university and the city and its region. I've had a particular interest in how we can use science and technology to drive regional economic growth.
Thank you, Professor Richard. And that's a question that the committee is very interested in as well. This is my first session as the chair of the new committee, and I think it's appropriate that my first question, I'll ask the first questions, that my first question should be to Sir Adrian, and of course witnesses and committee members can come in as appropriate. So, Sir Adrian, the UK has a world-leading science and research sector, I'm sure you would agree, punching well above its weight according to all measures. In your view, does this budget demonstrate a commitment by the government to advancing research and science in the UK?
The short answer is yes. I think the signals in that first budget are very positive. I think we have a science minister who recently said that discovery science is basically the goose that lays the golden eggs. So all those kind of signals are really welcome. But as we go forward, not to be complacent, you're right to say that the UK has punched well above its weight. But we have many kind of threats and stresses coming up. science and the competition for talent in science and engineering is international. So international positioning, we always have to keep an eye on what other countries are doing. Mm-hmm. And even with the very positive signals in the budget, we still remain about 11th in the OECD in terms of investment in R&D. And I'm sure you'll come on to the topic, but 80% of our public R&D goes through the university sector. We have world-leading universities. But as you know, and I'm sure Karen and others will pick up on it, I mean, there is angst in that sector about financial stability. So the basic context, we're still not up there with the biggest investors. We have to keep an eye on the talent pool. Is the mood music in the UK open to international collaboration, open to international talent? We have had in the political sphere some, over recent years, perhaps negative kind of feelings about migration, about overseas visitors, overseas students. So I think there's a whole holistic thing, very welcome news, looking forward to it being even better, of course, in the spending review. But we have some outstanding issues not entirely resolved. I think DCIT still has 3 reports on its books that the government has not fully responded to. The nurse report, looking at the landscape, the ecosystem of where we put research money into universities, into institutes, public sector research establishments. Will the government take a kind of view on whether we've got those balances right? And we have the issue of talent, whether it's international or homegrown. I think we still have major issues in the education system in terms of STEM education, in terms of inequalities, in terms of the MAD system, where roughly 50% of kids give up science and mathematics at the age of 16. So I think there are wider issues, but the short answer, the budget statement was very welcome.
Thank you, and you've raised a number of issues there, Adrian, which we will be coming on to. I know that the committee in this session and in future sessions will take a great interest in talent and investment and in the structure, if you like, of research funding. But just to come back to the budget itself, the science spend in the budget is £20.4 billion. That's a little over half of what Google spends and a quarter of what Amazon spends. It's 1.5% of public spending. Do you think that is the right figure? And coming to the government's manifesto for change, do you think this is a budget for change? And if so, what change can we expect to see?
So in terms of bandying percentage numbers, some comparisons are quite difficult because people count things in different ways. But I would come back to the thing that being 11th in terms of investment in OECD is not where you want to be if you want to be a leading science nation. In terms of change agenda, I mean, the mantra, I'm sure you'll agree, is growth, and underpinning that growth in a fundamental way is scientific research. And so the narrative, as I say, the science minister, science is the goose that lays the golden eggs. I mean, there are problems about hatching the eggs and so on, yes. But that's a slightly different issue. So I'm going to be unremittingly positive in the short term.
Thank you very much. And now coming to Dame Karen and Professor Richard. Sir Adrian's already raised the issues around university research funding. How will the budget allocation and tuition fee policies impact the university sector and its ability to sustain scientific research? And in her letter of the 4th of November, in which this Education Secretary raised tuition fees, she also said universities should make a stronger contribution to economic growth, and particularly to regional economic growth. How do you see that succeeding?
Shall I
I'll start with that. Yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we welcome universities welcome the rise in tuition fees, and of course that's really stopping the decline. It's not nearly enough, but it's a good signal going forward. And equally, we welcome the budget and the commitments to R&D. But I think what we've got to remember is that the whole ecosystem of research and development relies on universities. As we've heard, universities do the majority of the research in this country, and the ecosystem has been finely balanced with a lot of cross-subsidies, and our ability to drive economic growth as we do relies on that ecosystem being fully supported. And the impact of policy changes such as the visa changes, visa costs and so on has had a huge impact on universities, and we are I would say we're not recovering from that yet. So the decline in international students not only affects our talent pool, it affects our ability to drive growth locally as well. And this ecosystem has been working so well, and the foundations, my feeling is the foundations on which it's built are crumbling now, and we need to address that. So the impact of some policies on the funding, is fundamental to that. But I think largely, the Chancellor had difficult decisions to make, and given the context, we were very pleased with the R&D elements of the budget. The mission-based funding is absolutely critical to economic growth, and universities are keen to support that and to drive those missions. And I think if you look across the 5 missions, there's no university in the UK who wouldn't say that they contribute to those missions in various ways. So we're poised and ready to go.
That's fantastic. Great. Thank you. Professor Richard.
Yeah, just to emphasise a couple of points there. I mean, it is, the UK is an unusual country. It is an international outlier in terms of how much of public sector research takes place in universities. In many other countries, there's a lot of research that takes place in freestanding research institutes. So, the way our system has evolved puts particular emphasis on the universities. And we have funded it in a way such that it does rely, research in universities does rely on cross-subsidies from other activities, and those other activities have been generally teaching overseas students. So we have got ourselves into this state where the national research base, if you like, relies on those cross-subsidies. So I think that the budget, I think, was a very good stabilising budget in that it locked in the essentially the existing the increases that we've seen in the science budget in the previous government. I think the fee issue does help stabilise the system, but I think there are questions that remain about. In a sense, I think maybe the question is the amount of money in terms of percent of GDP is maybe not the right way of thinking about it. The right way of thinking about it is it delivering the results that we want. And the results that we would want to see, the bigger economic picture remains one of productivity growth that has stagnated since the global financial crisis. So it's about 25% down from where it would have been. We've got very large regional inequality in productivity. So in a sense, I think I can be positive that the budget stabilises the situation, but I don't think I would say that, by their fruits you shall know them. The outcome in terms of what the economy is currently doing says we're not really doing enough science and connecting that enough to economic growth to deliver the results that we want to see for the country.
That's excellent. So I think I'm hearing a welcome for the budget and the commitments in the budget, but concerns about how we assess the return that we're getting for our science investment, and also about the long-term or the sustainability of the cross-subsidy for the ecosystem for UK research. Now, I think, Kit, you would like to come in here, and then I'll...
Questions before. Sorry, I have to just nip out briefly. The first to Sir Adrian, I hear what you say about the OECD ranking table, but there's an argument about quality over quantity, right? And I think it's still the case that Trinity College, Cambridge has more Nobel Prizes for science than the whole of continental Europe put together, right? So how would we deal with that argument that actually these other countries might be throwing more money at it, but they're not producing what we produce? And then a question for Dame Karen. The 5 missions, I'm old enough to remember the 10 great technologies, and every sort of iteration of government comes up with 5, 8, 7, 13, all this. and I understand why universities and researchers would cooperate with a government that has, absolutely, if that's the way the funding. But is that actually the right way to do it? Does that skew research in a way that's overall productive for kind of general UK science? Or should the government be broadly mission neutral?
Shall I go first on no, I think when I said I looking at percentages of spends is not the end of the story at all. But you do have to watch what's happening in terms of investments elsewhere, and the environment it creates for the internationally mobile talent. And something we haven't quite touched on yet, the issue of a long-term commitment that this is a fundamentally important area of investment rather than a series of short-term policy switches, etc. So perhaps to emphasize a point I didn't emphasize earlier, long-term stability of whatever the levels of funding are gives confidence to individual researchers and their careers, and it also gives confidence to the inward investment. So, I agree, you can't just look at those input figures, but I think there is a danger of smugness. If you look at what's going on scientifically in China, we used to say, oh, they can't think, they just copy or whatever. Now they're leading scientific nation in many, many areas.
Thank you. And to address the...
Yeah, I mean, certainly the 5 missions. Absolutely, I agree with you. Over many years, government says this and we say, yes, that's a good idea, and we rush towards it. But genuinely, I think there's a balance between the directed research funding and also research funding which is unhypothecated, and it's discovery funding. So I think we have to maintain that balance. On the 5 mission lenses, though, I really feel strongly about this, because there's no doubt about it, we have to kickstart economic growth, and universities are the engines of economic growth, and they have a core role not only in the working with industry in terms of driving the economy with new technology and new investments, but also the skills piece in there. So with the kickstarting economic growth, absolutely universities are at the centre of that. And if you think about the technological advances that we're making in clean energy and net zero, nobody can argue that we need to get to net zero, that it's existential for the planet. So, and many universities have been driving their technologies towards that. And if you look at the work that we're doing at Cranfield with green energy, net zero, jet zero, the use of hydrogen, it's all directed towards that. So to have a government that it seems to be tuned into where the universities are directing their technology is really good. And even for a technological university, even the NHS Fit for the Future, everybody wants a good NHS. It's the cornerstone of the UK. But universities training, I mean, for instance, I have to bring up the level 7 apprenticeships here. One of the level 7 apprenticeships that we are doing is training NHS leadership, to deliver leadership better. And so if the another policy change, which probably isn't the remit of your committee, but if those level 7 apprenticeships go, then it destroys part of creating an NHS fit for the future. So there's a lot of aspects of policy which all need to be drawn together by this government. And talking to this government, I think that's the focus that is happening. So there is a lot more. I think there is a lot more cross-departmental understanding and willingness to talk, which is very welcome.
And indeed, that is the mission of the missions, as it were. And one of the committee's interest will be to see how we assess them. I was going to bring in Richard, and then I'll go to Adam and Lauren.
I mean, to agree with Karen, I mean, first of all, I remember the 8 great technologies. It's not been helpful that the average lifetime of a technology priority over the last 14 years has been about 2.5 years. That's not helpful. But I think we can argue about whether mission language is the right language or not, but I think it seems inarguable that the state has priorities. The state has lasting priorities. Generating economic growth is clearly one of them. Making the health system sustainable and humane is one of them. Increasingly, defending the country in an increasingly hostile world is another one. And securing energy security in this transition to net zero. These are just big strategic goals that the state has, and I'd have thought everybody would agree that those are really important, and that there should be a certain amount of direction of the more applied end of science and technology to support those goals. I think that there is absolutely an important place for undirected scientific research, because that's where that gives you resilience against unexpected changes in the future. It gives you the basis for entirely new things. But I think that having strategic goals that the science enterprise supports, I'd be surprised that anyone would disagree with that.
And I think it also, I agree with what you're saying, and it also gives the public an understanding of the return that we are getting for our investment in science, which is important. And in terms of the balance between core research, I think, Adam, you wanted to come in at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Gian. Good morning, all. Thank you for coming. So, Department for Science, Innovation and Technology has allocated $6.1 billion for core research. But in your three opinions, what do you think should be contained within core research as a concept?
I'll go first if you want. I think the whole point of discovery research is that it is sort of undirected, and so saying it should consist of X, Y, Z is kind of counterfactual in some way. There's a predecessor of mine as president of the Royal Society once said there are two types of research: applied and not yet applied. So bear that in mind, I think.
Thank you. Dame Karen?
Yeah, I mean, what I understood by the core research is the research that's directed through UKRI and so on. So, the research funding system that we have at the moment.
So which effectively leaves UK Innovate outside of that. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, it's a term of art that is, the research councils, Research England, corresponding bits from devolved administrations, and the national academies. I think it's not entirely coincident with undirected research, because there is research that the research council support that falls in supporting priorities or missions or whatever we want to call them. I think the bigger question of how much would you carve out for purely undirected research is an interesting one. I mean, in a sense, European funding does it more explicitly, in the sense that the European Research Council would look like very blue skies research, and that gives you some, in another system that gives you a balance. But I think they're two slightly different questions. The core research budget as a term of art in our current system, and how much you think the balance should be between totally undirected and more mission-driven.
Brilliant, thank you very much, three. So, kind of related to those points that you've made, actually, within, maybe with reference to the UKRI impact frameworks and the necessity that we have for demonstrating impact, how do we ensure that we have that low technology readiness level, that low that blue sky stuff still happening within that core research framework?
I think that's a really important purpose of the UKRI and the research councils. It's for the research councils to make their decisions, and for UKRI in assessing how they spend money that they get that balance right.
Brilliant. Thank you, Professor.
Do you see, I mean, briefly, because it's a big subject, but do you see a need for change in the way in which UKRI makes those assessments?
I think that there was a recent review of UKRI, which had a number of recommendations about how it should do things. I think there are places where UKRI could change. I think there's in things like the balance between the amount of interdisciplinary research, the way that research across those boundaries is supported. I think UKRI is still a work in progress. Hasn't been going for very long. I think there's room for things to change.
Okay. In terms of the structure of funding, I'll bring in Lauren at this point.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to just follow up on just one thing about the education. I think, Sir Adrian, you you mentioned about the education system and the talent pipeline.
Sorry.
Do you think that there's an issue about opportunity and access to project work, so coursework at A level or or GCSE level, which is really not exposed children to project-based thinking, practical skills, and this may be having an impact on their choice in choosing a wet lab science or engineering? And then just on that point, and then shall I wait and then ask another question?
Yeah, so can I start with the sort of big picture education issues and the link through to skills? We haven't really talked about sort of skills and people. But in the broad brush system, you do have this cleavage at the age of 16 where, half the population is giving up on stuff. Working back through the system, there has been a decline in, school laboratories, the ability to do projects, etc., and that is certainly something that I think needs addressing. But I think this committee should take, even though, you might say it's DFE business, should take a great interest in the educational system. Look at the inequalities, regional and otherwise, of people getting STEM education, the skills base that then drives. So I do think the skills thing is really important. We recently produced a report in the Royal Society called Maths Futures, which is basically noting that if you look at the curriculum for mathematics in schools, it's as though computers and data didn't exist. And those are the real drivers of everything, as it were, in a digital age. So I think there is a massive need for a rethink, and I think it is of as much interest to DSIT and this committee as it is to education per se. The things you've mentioned are just part of a much wider malaise, I think.
I couldn't agree more. Now on to my main question, which I was going to ask, is about the proposed 10-year model for funding for R&D, and just sort of like to hear your thoughts about how we think it should be structured and what kind of factors do you think we need to take into account for prioritising long-term priorities for R&D? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely welcome long-term funding. It gives stability. I think it gives stability. I think it'll support investment, co-investment from industry, because if people know that there's something's not going to be cut halfway through, so I think it's absolutely welcome. It's something we've been asking for a long time, and clearly people have been listening. I think we need to, and Universities UK will obviously be keen to work with government on this. We need to, look at the policy around that, look at the potential budgets that it supports, and also mitigating against unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences of long-term funding is, of course, things change through the duration of that funding. So inflation, costs going up, national insurance perhaps going up again, those sort of things that come to bite you when you've got a fixed budget. So as long as those 10-year budgets can be flexibly applied, I think it certainly, what I understand by it is it's setting ring-fenced budgets, not necessarily setting 10-year project budgets, and I think that is good. And I think that the 10-year horizon for this enables us to imagine the art of the possible in those funding programs, which is really helpful. But I do think the big thing for me is it will prompt co-investment. It'll enable us to get co-investment, which is a good thing.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think there have been too many examples of very short-term projects where we haven't let things have run long enough. So to give you one example, from the budget, it was a very good thing that the Innovation Accelerator programme was extended. That's a very rare example of a kind of place-focused funding intervention, and the previous government had given it essentially just a two-year time. So it's impossible to demonstrate that things are actually working if you're just constantly chopping and changing them.
Just finally on the place-based, how do we ensure that money is spread to not just the current institutions that may be benefiting from a lot of money, which they will be doing lots of really great things, but how do we ensure that it gets further afield other institutions and universities across the country?
I think there's. I think that there's. To step back, we have very big discrepancies, if you like, in how much R&D, public R&D money is spent across the country. So, you know, more than half of the R&D money is spent in essentially the Greater South East. So we've got parts of the country like the West Midlands, the East Midlands, the North West, where actually there's proportionally less public sector R&D than there is actually private sector R&D. So there is a need, I think, to increase the research capacity. So I think that absolutely involves what you're saying. It means spreading out research into other kinds of institutions. I think that's best done collaboratively. I think it's best done collaboratively both in the sense of collaboration between national organisations like UKRI, Innovate UK has clearly got a very important role in translational research. I think with the emerging picture of regional government that we're getting, city regions and mayoral combined authorities, I think it means universities need to come together and collaborate more. So universities in a city, and in Greater Manchester we have 5 universities that we are seeing increasingly collaborating. So that allows us to spread the capacity to do good research to those other places. And I think that then allows one to respond to the needs of local industry and local economies better. So I think that kind of this collaboration, co-creation, these are the words that I think that we should be emphasising.
Can I build on that? Can we not also forget the role of the Royal Academy of Engineering? And they've done some fantastic work in working with industry and pushing out funds, away from the South East. So I think that, the Royal Society, Royal Academy, they have a key role to play in this as well.
Make one further point on the long-term thing, and we haven't talked about it explicitly, but, part of the research ecosystem and landscape are big pieces of kit, facilities, synchrotrons, etc., etc. We do have a bit of a habit of starting up something new and glossy and then not. The capital goes in and then the running costs don't sort of follow. It's the batteries not included syndrome. So there is an issue there to be thought about.
In terms of the long-term funding models, just to summarise on that, then I think that the issue with regard to infrastructure, which Sir Adrian is raising, what I'm hearing from Dame Karen and Professor Jones is that there shouldn't be a conflict between long-term funding models and diversity of destination, if you like, when it comes to that funding. So I think clearly it mustn't be a case of 10-year funding models, meaning that the same money is going to the same establishments and the same places, regardless of excellence or regardless of subject matter. And I think what you're saying to me, or you're saying to the committee, is that you don't think there's necessarily a conflict there, but I do think it's something that we need to be aware of. Right, and now I'm going to bring in Emily. Emily.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Sir Smith, for raising the diamond synchrotron. I think it would have been remiss of you being here without mentioning it, so thank you for that. I've got a question, and it very much relates to what you've been talking about, long-term collaboration and international competitiveness about Horizon. Obviously, due to Brexit, we left Horizon. I want to understand from you what you think the impact of leaving Horizon, and now that the government is absolutely committed to rejoining Horizon, what we need to do to rebuild those relationships and our impact and the impact into the UK of the Horizon programme.
Well, I mean, shall I start? I mean, the impact of leaving Horizon was devastating on partnerships, on collaboration, on advancing science, because we all know that if you work in collaboration, you know, it's greater than the sum of the parts. So very, very welcome that we've rejoined it. Very welcome. You know, early indications show that applications have increased. So I think that people were there was a pent up enthusiasm for applications. And so I think that it's a fantastic thing. And I think that anything that the government can do to support our participation is welcome in that, but you know, we are right behind this. I think in terms of FP10, obviously the universities want to play a constructive role to maximise the huge benefit of that programme, and we've got, you know, some offers to make to the principals there.
The only thing I would add is to put it in a slightly broader context. I mean, we really do need at some point to get our heads around, do we have an international strategy in the context of science and research, which Horizon is a part, but there are massive things that go on outside Horizon.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Great.
Great, thank you. And just to follow up, I've got a couple of questions. The first, in terms of, we're obviously catching up on funding for Horizon as part of the current budget. So what's your view in terms of the impact of that currently within the current sort of budget?
Just to put in context, there was significant discussion before, or rumours before the budget, as to how the Horizon funding would be accounted for, and that it would be effectively a cut, whereas the budget showed a separate allocation for it.
Well, there was a commitment at an earlier stage, a few years ago, that it would be paid for in a particular way, and I think the concern was that would be torn up and it would be cut out of UKRI. I think that was the rumour that was going around. I did not spread that rumour myself.
Good. And then just in terms of how we measure the impact of our participation in Horizon, what's your view on how we measure that? Obviously, it's rated, it's through sort of EU institutions, European institutions, and so how do we make sure that we maximise both our participation and the outputs of participating in the programmes?
Well, you know, Karen might want to comment, but I mean, at the end of the day, we maximise the value of the participation by applying and winning grants and forming networks and cooperations that otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. So, I mean, the rejoining has been fairly recent. There is an upward trend now in participation, and hopefully that will continue. But, I mean, the really big question, I mean, the terrible question that we can never answer is how do you measure value of return in the short term from the investment? And you can't. It's the long term.
I mean, there's a very important question of talent attraction that comes with Horizon. Horizon funding is very portable, and you know, we were already starting to see people holding particularly ERC grants, just saying, "Well, I'm off somewhere else, which is going to be more congenial." So, the UK, and ERC is a particular case in point. The UK was exceptionally successful in winning those grants, and part of that is actually getting people to move to the UK, getting the most talented scientists to move to the UK to take those opportunities. So that attraction, that ability to attract top people is really a very important part of that.
Can I reinforce that? The exodus of international researchers when we left Horizon was just palpable. You know, people were just leaving. People were saying, that's the reason I'm leaving, taking their grants with them, because the UK is not a place to do world-leading science anymore. And that's you know, a stunning researcher to tell you that, you know, they no longer feel they're in a place where we can do world-leading science. And it is about world-leading science, and it is about the research outputs that we produce from those. And it's also about the impact of those people on the people around them in any university. You know, they have an uplifting effect on all of the scientists around them.
Emily,
I just wanted to kind of come. Has this government done enough to rebuild that reputation of this is a place to do world-leading research and attract back that talent we lost during those years? And if not, what should it be doing?
It's somewhat early days to judge this government. If by this government you mean this government. But I think important, signals are very important. You know, it's not just about cash.
Right.
It's about the cultural kind of cross-referencing and all the rest of it. So I think there is still work to do in the narrative that we are an open, you know, not open borders, but an open country to talent.
Let me bring Stephen now.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked sort of tangentially about the sort of skills base and getting people into the country. Clearly, the funnel through secondary schools isn't good enough. Removal from Horizon sort of wrecked that for a few years at least. What are some of the other challenges that you face in getting researchers and people to come here to participate in science sort of programs in this country?
I think it's implicit in some of the things we've said. I mean, long-term commitment that we care and we regard this scientific investment as fundamental to the future of the UK sends the right kind of signals. There are micro-level things which are very irritating in terms of visa costs and the rest, but we ought to be able to fix that. But I think it's the overall kind of mood music and narrative.
Can I ask, do you anticipate that the UK should be able to return to the levels of Horizon participation and sort of successful grant awarding that we had when the UK was part of the European Union?
You're asking for predictions.
No, not a prediction. I'm asking for an assessment of the likelihood.
I would say, why not?
Good.
I would say,
Thank you, Adrian.
I was going to say it's possible, but there's an awful lot of rebuilding of trust, and the relationships that we lost when we were out, you know, they take a long time to rebuild. So yes, I would agree possible, but you know, there's some work to be done.
Right, Richard.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think those networks take time, you know, and if there's a long-term sense that the UK is in this for the long term, then people will invite us back into those networks again, and we can be influencing the shape of those calls and influencing the way the programme evolves.
We look forward to making our contribution to supporting that. Now, I'd like to ask Josh to come in.
I'm conscious of time. How long do we have? We have 1 minute.
No, I think we can go on till 10:30 actually.
Fine. Okay.
On this, we have a hard stop at 10:30.
Well, maybe I'll just ask this question as a sort of bundle, and then you can each pick off the bit that's most relevant. So, I'd like to look ahead a bit towards the spending review and pick up on a few of the things that you've said in relation to what the department should be thinking about in that spending review. So. The top line question is, what should its priorities be in the spending review, in your view? But the two elements I'd like to specifically hear about, one is to pick up on your point, Sir Adrian, about skills and the department playing more of a role in it. I went on a tour of a local technical college in Wigan, and they do some fantastic work, but both their maths and their computer science programme are sort of 20 years out of date, really. They're not data-driven statistical analysis, you know, the kind of core skills that you need. So what role do you think the department should play? You say more of a role, but what role and sort of how should it go about doing that? And does it have implications for what it should be pushing for in the spending review? That's the first part. And then the second part is more broadly, the CDDO, Incubator for AI, Government Digital Service have all now been brought under the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. It's not clear how much budget has been allocated to underpin those. But of course, the better coordination by the government of data is a vital part of the future of research and scientific progress more generally. So what else would you like to see, both sort of from the department and again, in terms of implications for the spending review, in bringing together that more strategic, coherent way of thinking about the future of data in and around government?
First go. A more embracing word than just the data really is infrastructure. We do need a careful look at the competitiveness of infrastructure and the long-term investments and batteries included to go with that.
Can you give some specific examples of infrastructure there, Sage?
Well, it's since I mentioned the synchrotron, I'll mention the synchrotron again. But up at Harwell, you know, we have X-ray sources, we have neutron sources, we have molecular biology laboratories, and so on. So there is part of that landscape where to be at the cutting edge of science and to attract the brightest and the best, they have to have the facilities, and so it's part of the internationally competitive thing again. Do we have are we up there? Because if we don't, people won't come here to work, they'll go elsewhere. But it hasn't been traditional to see data as part of that infrastructure debate. So that would be, I think, my main contribution, is data is a fundamental part of the infrastructure going forward.
Very good.
And all pervasive. And I think work to do there to underpin and invest in the right kind of ways. But we've got fantastic resources that we were the first in the world to do, things like the biobank and so on and so forth. I think a lot more attention to that data as a fundamental asset in a digital age.
Excellent.
Yeah, for me, obviously, what we universities will be looking for is a sustained commitment to increased R&D funding and a sustained commitment to increasing QR funding. I don't know whether you've all come across the Universities UK Blueprint, which was published a while ago, a few months ago. I would say that if you look in there, there's quite a lot of suggestions of what we would like and what we would do for that. One of the things I'd alert you to is the recommendation for mission innovation funding. To stimulate research and innovation towards addressing the government missions and the industrial strategy. And of course, I think the industrial strategy paper will be published at around the same time. So I would urge you to link up the sustained investment in R&D with the industrial strategy, because they've got to be interconnected, haven't they?
If I can come to the skills point, I think it's a really important one. I think there's a long history of failure to join up innovation policy and skills policy. And so if we're going to get innovation-led growth in places like Wigan or North East Greater Manchester, we're going to need skilled people, not just at PhD level, but skilled technical skills that come from the FE sector. And I think historically we've done very badly at connecting up what the FE sector does with the with what universities do. And I think that's something, in GM, Innovate UK, again, they gave us a one-year pilot programme to do with Further Education Innovation Fund. And I think that was very helpful in terms of getting more connections between Wigan and Lee College is actually a pretty good college, I think, and Anna Dawes a very excellent leader. But it's allowed us to connect the FE sector with the universities in Greater Manchester in very practical ways, like we're currently training PhD students to be able to go to colleges and help them in these all-important digital skills where they find it difficult to find people to do that training. So I think, if we take a holistic view of regional industrial strategy, if you like, which brings together the fundamental R&D that provides, the seed corn for it, more applied translational research, brings together the university sector and the FE sector in a place, build that into a kind of national picture through, meshing regional industrial strategies with the national industrial strategy. I think that's how we can, get that full translation of scientific excellence into private sector R&D, into highly productive companies that are giving good quality jobs at all levels to people in places all across the country.
That's a really important point. It's something that we want to see, that integration, indeed, reaping the benefits of research and development and spillover effects across our country. Now we are coming to the last 10 minutes, so I'm going to bring Josh in quickly, and then I know Martin has a point to make, and then Emily, you were going to come in on institutions, yes?
Yeah, just to underscore that point, Professor Jones, it's helpful to think of Greater Manchester as actually a case study in what works well. And in my area, we have Wigan and Lee College, we have St John Rigby College, and both of those are fantastic educators of exactly the sort of skills that are not generally looked at because they're below that sort of PhD level, but actually in terms of growth, and growth being widely distributed, are super important. I've just got one quick follow-up to Sir Adrian Smith, and this may be looking ahead too much, but the data bill is being brought back to Parliament, and it's something we will be looking at. And data as infrastructure is one way to describe the sort of core conceptual framing of that bill and the many different things that it does. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but if you have, I would be interested in whether you think the bill, in a satisfactory way, does that as currently published.
Yeah, no, I don't feel competent to say I've pored over such words as I've seen. But there is a whole host of stuff in and around data. I mean, it has to be collected, it has to be stored, it has to be processed. You know, there's an ecosystem around data that I'm not sure all angles of that are captured in what's being talked about at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Not to speak of the skill sets required to exploit it.
Both in the private and public sector. Martin.
Thank you very much. Professor Jones, you've mentioned a couple of times things that intrigued me. You talked about the productivity problems in the economy. You've talked about the gap in technical skills to follow up and embed innovation. Are we missing a trick, and that we're not looking at what you might regard as basic hygiene, a bit like the NHS not having an electronic patient record, but looking at AI and twiddly bits to investigate high-end? We focus too much like a squirrel on the latest shiny thing and not actually embedding the innovation and research that we have in this country anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and there's a lot of focus now on the diffusion of innovation, and it was a welcome announcement in the budget that Dame Angela McLean was doing a review of innovation diffusion. That's good. I think yes, we've not built institutions that focus enough on diffusion, and so we have the catapult centres, and they've been, I think, they were a good innovation, and in places like Sheffield and Coventry and Teesside, they've been, valuable additions to the landscape. But I think in the way that they were set up with rather a narrow view about they were, to do translational research in technology readiness levels 4 to 7, if I remember rightly, which is quite a narrow view. And I think there's a case to be made, and I wrote a paper actually with Owen O'Sullivan from the Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing, arguing that compared to other international examples have a much more explicit mandate to build manufacturing and innovation capacity in a regional economy. And actually, I mean, the truth is actually some of the catapult centres have actually done that, and they, addressing skills, translation, diffusion of innovation, all those sorts of things. But I think that the catapult centres that have done it despite the fact it's not actually in their mandate. They've done it because they think it's important. So I think there's room for us to think about, the institutions there. We can build institutions that have a more explicit mandate to link up to the skills, to link up to, to provide technology intelligence, all the things that you would do to build supply chains, to help, to support companies enter supply chains, to move up the value chain, to get more higher value business. So I think there is room there for a bit of institutional development.
Thank you, Professor Jones. That's very interesting. I think Adam's going to be in briefly, and then...
Yes, thanks. Yes, Professor Jones, great point. I think I agree. I'm going to assume that the institutes that you're talking about internationally, they're probably the Fraunhofers and things like that, right? How would you see that mandate, I guess specifically, how would you see that mandate changing for the catapults to bring it more in line with some of those maybe more successful international examples?
As I say, I think it's perhaps that they. I mean, I think they have an important national mandate, and they shouldn't lose that. So it's important that they retain a technology niche where they're absolutely at the frontier in that technology niche. But I think there's a place for them to work more closely with their local, their local business space. And I think this is particularly important. Places like Greater Manchester is a good example. It's a very SME-driven economy. And it's what do you do to support those SMEs to find higher value niches to operate? How can you support them in the skills and innovation that you need? So I think that's the sort of area. I think this is thinking about the whole ecosystem. It's partly to do with thinking about how we can scale up spin-outs more. I think there's a widely held view that we're actually quite good at producing spin-outs, but they all kind of there's a big tendency for them to leave the country when they scale up. So I think thinking about what environment would you need to have around a spin-out that wanted to scale up, and that's that's part of the thinking. You know, in Greater Manchester, we launched a collaboration with Cambridge on this very issue. That there's so much fantastic stuff to learn from Cambridge about how to make, you know, a really great deep tech innovation system. But the missing link seems to be, how do we get those people to build their first factory? You know, not in Leipzig, but in Rotherham or Wigan or Stoke or.
Thank you very much. And we will be looking at those challenges in our next evidence panel. I am going to ask Emily to come in briefly now. This will be also give you opportunities for any closing thoughts. So I think we have 2 minutes.
So given the time, I'm going to resist the debate about the catapults and what
well
the
done.
original intention were, but just to say we will be visiting Milton Keynes, won't we, and the impact of catapults on the SMEs within Milton Keynes and the important collaborations with Cranfield and other institutions, and perhaps we'll discuss that afterwards, Mr. Jones, Professor Jones. I really wanted to come back to big picture here, the government missions, in particular 2 elements that I want to hear from you, because we've talked about more broadly. Obviously, the missions are very much outcome-based, as opposed to specific choices of technologies or research areas. But how do you see 2 elements? One, the framework of UK institutions and how they can help and align around our UK missions. And I'm talking about not just growth, but security, health, all of them. And I've just forgotten the second part of that question. So we'll do that because we don't run out of time.
Excellent. And any closing thoughts? And I will also add to Emily's question as if regard to place and our discussion around the integration of research and development and regional economics, would you devolve research and development funding?
So the question on R&D and missions, essentially, I mean, I think leads into what my closing remark would be. Both the missions and the stuff we were talking about, skills and a holistic approach to data, fundamentally depend on cross-departmental working in government. And I think that has always been the issue of the age. And so announcing the missions, great. But the actual mechanisms, we don't want to go back to square one and say, now we have the missions, let's work out the R&D agenda for each mission. I mean, basically, the R&D landscape, it can map onto missions in various ways. But how are we going to deliver? And my particular bugbear in terms of the education system and our Maths Futures report from the Royal Society, we've got to get a totally different focus on things like data and the understanding of data and awareness of data. And how do you do this when curriculum review is owned by a particular department? I just think we need a lot more effort, and DCIT should be involved in practically everything.
Thank you.
My closing remark is that I would like the committee to be aware that the research funding system in universities is structurally unsustainable. So universities incur deficit in their research activities, which we cross-subsidise through other things, which has been taken away. And in answer to your question, Chi, about would you devolve R&D funding, devolve to who? Because at the moment, the system of UKRI and the Royal Academies distributing the funding is a well-known and it's a very it's a peer-reviewed. It's a funding devolution, funding allocation based on excellence and based on judgment. And who would you give the funding to, and how would they make that judgment? You know, I think that's a really key question.
I think your answer is no then, but yes, thank you. And finally, Professor Jones.
Yeah, I think the principle of excellence as the foundation for our upstream blue skies research, that's really important. So I think that still should be run nationally. I would add, of course, one can influence where excellent research takes place by where you put the infrastructure. So the fact that the synchrotron is in Harwell made quite a big difference, has been demonstrated by a very nice paper by Henry Overman. So had you put the synchrotron somewhere else, that would have attracted excellence to those other places. Yes. I think the question is probably different for translational research, for more applied research, where I think it needs to be, connected with an industrial base that does have a regional element. And I think there's more of a case, maybe not for devolution, but for co-creation with people who understand the local economy. And I think, the Innovation Accelerator actually worked out to be quite a good example of how that might happen with, collaboration between Innovate UK and Mayoral Combined Authority.
Thank you very much. I want to thank each of our witnesses. We've covered a lot of ground. I've failed to bring it to in conclusion within the sort of allotted hour, but we're 2 minutes over, and I think that's a reflection of the interest of the committee and also the wide nature of the subjects that you've raised and the issues you've raised. And I would really just like to thank you so very much. I think it was an excellent first panel, and I think I'm going to say order. Order. And we're now proceeding to our second panel on the Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee public evidence session on scrutinising the budget. And I'm very pleased to welcome our second panel, which is Dr. Alicia, the Executive Director of the Campaign for Science and Engineering, Stephen Phipson, CBE, Chief Executive Officer, Make UK, and Dom Hallas, the Executive Director of the Startup Coalition. I'm going to ask each of you to give a short introduction to yourself and your organisation, and then we will proceed to questions focusing on the budget impact on R&D intensive businesses. So I'll start with Stephen, if I'm okay to call you Stephen.
Thank you very much, Jay, and very good morning to you. So Stephen Phipson, Chief Executive of Make UK. Make UK has been around 125 years. It's the national organisation for manufacturing, the business representative organisation. We're representing around about 20,000 manufacturing businesses across all sectors, which employ about 1 million people out of the 2.6 million we have in manufacturing in this country. And we have 72 trade bodies in membership and 32 universities. So a really broad church that's been around for quite a long time.
Which reflects our country's great heritage in
yes.
and industry. Thank you very much. Dr. Alicia?
Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Greated. I'm the Exec Director of CASE. We're the UK's independent leading advocates of R&D. So our members include a lot of universities, businesses, charities, professional bodies. So we feel we're the voice across R&D, which is a really privileged place to be. In terms of my background, I've worked in research and innovation funding and strategy my whole life. And I've done that in the UK for UKRI and also heading up something called KTN, which is an innovation agency. And I also spent a significant of my time overseas, building UK overseas partnerships in research and development.
Thank you. Thank you. And CASE may also be known as or was previously known as the Campaign for Science and Engineering, which does what it says on the tin. Dom Hallas.
Yeah, so my name's Dom Hallas. I'm the Executive Director of the Startup Coalition, which is a lobby group for tech startups and scale-ups in the UK. So we have a community of 3,000 plus entrepreneurs and investors focused on building the best technology-driven startups in the United Kingdom.
Great. Now, in the previous session, we discussed the impact of the budget on the science and innovation and technology sort of communities. Here we're focusing on research-intensive businesses, but the impact or the sort of the continuation, as was said, the government and the Minister for Science recognise that research and development is the goose that lays the golden eggs. We may have challenges in hatching those eggs, as Sir Adrian, I think it was, put it, and that is what we're here to look at in more detail in this session. And I'm going to go first to Martin to ask the first question.
Well, thank you very much. So I come from a background very much working with sort of tech startups for the last 10 years or so and doing similar sort of things. I think the first question really is pretty similar to the first one that we asked the first panel. Is this budget doing enough? Where should it be doing more? What could it be doing more? Is it in the right directions?
Great. And well, let's first, Stephen.
What we welcomed in the budget was the commitment again to the long-term industrial strategy. That's something that really is important to the manufacturing sector in this country, particularly looking at a 10-year framework, bearing in mind that average investments in manufacturing in this country are between 7 and 30 years. So particularly inward investments looking at that long-term commitment to the plan. So that's an important, again, reiterated by the Chancellor in her budget speech, was very important. We also liked very much the commitment to digital adoption support through what's called Made Smarter, which the Chancellor again announced in the budget in an otherwise quite difficult budget. That was actually very, very important. We've had several thousand businesses going through the pilot schemes. The next phase of that is the national adoption and digitisation for manufacturing in this country, absolutely vital. We're still behind in things like our robot population, for example. If we compare ourselves to other countries at the moment, we've got 111 robots per 10,000 employees in manufacturing. That puts us about number 24 in the world. So we need to get more and more companies adopting those digital technologies in the manufacturing sector, particularly around the SMEs, which is really where that Made Smarter programme is focused. If you look at manufacturing in this country, it's made up of about 800 large companies and 200,000 SMEs. That's the structure of it. So focusing on the diffusion and adoption of technology around that 200,000 community is really welcome in terms of that support on Made Smarter. Of course, in the short term, we have some challenges as to give some balance to that around the increase in pre-profit taxes in particular, and we'll see the effect of that in a short term. But we were very pleased about the long-term commitments, I think, that came out of the budget.
Thank you. And Dr. Greater?
Yeah, I'd reiterate everything that everybody's said on this. I think in terms of our members and our community, this was a really good outcome from R&D, both in terms of the financial commitments, but the narrative, I think, was really important for us when we were listening to the Chancellor's speech. It was very clear that R&D was seen as underpinning all the big strategic priorities and growth, obviously, of the UK. And that strategic stability and direction, again, reiterating what other people have said, is really positive.
However, the devil's in the detail. and I think what we are looking at in case is firstly at what's going to happen with the DSET allocations itself. So what will happen with UKRI? We didn't hear Innovate UK being mentioned at all, and it was interesting hearing your questions before about core research funding, because one thing I'd want to reiterate very strongly is R&D is dependent on an ecosystem, and none of the core research will never sit in isolation. Business doesn't sit in isolation. Charities don't sit in isolation. They're all dependent on each other. So that's one example. The second example would be relating to, you mentioned, Chair, at the beginning, 20.4 billion. And we now have a departmental breakdown, but we don't know the comparable figures year on year. So when we took a look at that in a bit more detail, for example, with Defence R&D, we feel there's a cut from 3 billion to 1.7 billion, but is that a real cut? You don't know if that's comparable. So these are the sort of questions we'd be asking. But it feels very positive. It places us in a great position for the spring spending review. I'd also just add on to what Adrian Smith said about the UK's position. He said it was 11th, which is correct in OECD, to do with, based on public and private investment. But we're actually 27th in the same report he's referring to if you just look at public investment. So I think that's interesting and important for us to think about. And I just wanted to make one final comment. It's not really about business, but it's about taxpayers and it's about the public. And I wanted to reiterate from our work at CASE, we're doing a lot on the public attitudes to R&D, and there's a great support. 70% of the public want to support R&D. They feel it's important, and business being a critical part of that. So I think we're in a good place, but we can definitely not sit on our laurels. There's a lot more work to do.
Thank you, Dr. Greathead. And we will be raising questions on the specifics of budgets, of science budgets, particularly on departmental spend. I think the issue that you mentioned there of the being, I think a theme of our discussion already has been how do you measure success, and is it 20.4 billion, or is it, and how do we measure what we're achieving with science spend and what the right parameters should be. Your point about we are actually lower when it comes to public and private spend, to public spend. We are lower when it comes to public spend alone than when it comes to public and private spend. I find my understanding that we are lower also in the rankings when it comes to attracting private investment, private R&D investment. So I think that relationship is something that we'll also be wanting to look at. But thank you very much. And Dom.
Yeah, I mean, look, the budget was not good for tech startups. It also wasn't disastrous. I think like the bold reality is when taxes go up on your business, it's never a good thing for you. So, you know, whether it's the NIC increases or capital gains tax going up, in the case of capital gains, really important for tech employees as much as it is for founders themselves, and the role that share options in particular plays in incentivizing people into early stage businesses. Also things like carried interest that materially impact the venture capital ecosystem that funds all the companies in the technology startup ecosystem. And then things like BADR, the artist formerly known as Entrepreneurs Relief, that really obviously impacts on entrepreneurs as well. So, you know, they're not good, right? We have to be honest, and we were super candid with the Treasury on that. I think when it came to the sort of most disastrous predictions of the ecosystem, and if I'm honest, like entrepreneurs were pretty scared ahead of this budget. I don't think those came true. I think we would have sort of seen significantly worse outcomes if that was the case. And so I think there's kind of two lessons from that. The first is what it tells us is that founders, you know, the sort of disastrous predictions of is everyone going to flee the country? Is this all going to be sort of terrifying? I don't think that is the case. I think ultimately entrepreneurs are hardy enough not to be scared off by a 2 or 3% increase in their marginal tax rate. But at the same time, I do think there is now a sort of story that needs to be told to these kind of entrepreneurs about why they should stay here and why they should build their businesses here, in particular given how mobile these entrepreneurs are in comparison to the businesses of the past. And so I think that's sort of really, really critical part of the story for this government moving forward in a post-budget world. But I agree with the two of the panelists in terms of the positives. You know, the public R&D budget being protected is really, really important. Actually, the other thing that's really important for our businesses is the protection of R&D tax credits and the generosity of tax credits, which have been cut significantly in recent years, but are going to be retained through the cycle. So there are positives to tell the story about, but ultimately, you know, for our businesses, it was pretty choppy.
Great, thank you very much. Emily,
So we heard from the previous panelists, and it's been a big discussion within our group, as our team as well, about the productivity gap, the challenge of economic growth and others, and how the interplay of the R&D budget and the industrial strategy green paper work together to create that environment. Do you think that there, first of all, is enough read across those two strategies? And what elements do you think may be missing with those to create that right environment, exactly as Dom just said, to ensure that we're creating the right environment? As we know, it's much more than just R&D and tax. There's a whole ecosystem here. So what are those elements that are good, but also what are those elements that are missing between those two strategies and budget allocations?
So, Stephen.
You first, right. So, right, industrial strategy, absolutely vital to really bring together all those resources against some clear long-term objectives. And I think that's what's being craved by inward investors in particular, if you look at large manufacturing investments in this country. And being clear about linking together the R&D programme and the education programme. I think the most important thing, which we have to keep an absolute rifle focus on, which is really what I talk to most ministers about at the moment, is the skill shortage problem. And this is not going away. And if we look at our manufacturing and engineering resources in this country, our workforce average age is 52. We have 20% of them retiring in the next 7 to 10 years, if we look at that time frame. We currently have 62,000 vacancies, which is the highest it's ever been. We have an apprentice programme which is declining each year. So since the levy was introduced in 2016, our apprentice starts are down 42% as of last year. It is not working. We're not getting the right vocational skills. And if you ask any of the chief executives of any of the large manufacturing organisations, the number one issue on their agenda over the next 10 years is going to be having the right skills for all the new technologies and all the great opportunities we've got, particularly the ones that we can bring together in industrial strategy. We are calling for what's got to be a skills revolution here if we're going to sustain the growth that we're talking about. So if there's something I don't think there's enough emphasis on yet, it's that skills agenda and just how critical that is.
It was emphasised to us in the earlier session that skills is something that this committee should be looking at. So thank you.
Nice. I'll go last because I've got all these academic things to say. I've got a long list.
That's fine. Maybe you can think about how you summarise it.
So I think when it comes to the industrial strategy, look, obviously tech is one of the kind of core strands as identified by DBT. I think that the way we think about technology is actually, should it be a kind of vertical part of a strand of, one of 5 strands in a strategy, or should it actually be a kind of enabler across the entire industrial strategy? And I think that, from our perspective, how do you sort of thread that throughout the conversation? Because if you don't do that when it comes to technology, you don't have a 21st century industrial strategy, you have a 20th century industrial strategy. And so it's quite obvious that that's going to have to be a core part of it. I think when it comes to the way in which we can leverage some of the both R&D budget, but then also the different programs that government runs amongst the sort of coterie of quangos and support on offer, it's really a question for us of how do you identify the technologies that are, the most sort of the biggest priority technologies, the previous government would have called it the 5 key technologies, and ultimately support companies and innovators from idea and conception of idea all the way on their journey in building a business, and what role does the government play in some of those? So if you take, for example, climate tech, where we've done an awful lot of work, what we know is there's a very clear sort of funding gap at a certain point, what's called the Valley of Death. And ultimately, the question then is, okay, well, how do we drill down on that and say, if you're building an industrial strategy that focuses on climate, as this government wants to do, how do you solve that problem at that stage in the process? It might be that you have then a different problem when it comes to deep tech companies where, okay, the journey will be similar. You have a sort of longer gestation period for a kind of business, but actually it might be that going to market is more challenging. So how do we, as a government, hone in on that and understand what that means? And so it really is about kind of leveraging the whole journey of government support. And I think at the moment, one of the challenges is these can be quite bitty. So you have research funding agencies and that big pot of 20 billion plus of funding that feels quite detached from the support that government might provide in different areas for, say, access to markets or supporting people to do overseas international trade. And I think really it's about saying, okay, you have to work holistically together and unify the different parts of government and say, this is the mission, and this is, in many ways, that's the point of an industrial strategy, is to be like, this is the plan, how do we align everyone behind it and drive towards it? But I think, what it risks doing if we don't have that kind of level of coordination is you've basically got lots of different plans in lots of different places and lots of civil servants running off in lots of different directions in a very worthy way, but not ultimately achieving an awful lot. And so making sure there's that level of alignment and that the ideas are all pushing in the same direction is really important.
I think perhaps, thank you very much. I think perhaps one question for us would be where that responsibility for that alignment should be lying within government and how we can track and assess it. But Alicia, let's...
Yeah, I agree with all the points made. So when we speak to business, the two biggest issues, one is that consistency of strategy and policy. So all the things you were talking about, and the other one is funding and that journey of funding, and that there's gaps, it's very bitty. So on the strategy, if you look at what we've got at the moment, we've got the missions, we've got the industrial strategy, we've got the science and technology framework, if we keep that. So how do we make that really clear that we've got not, because when you look at it all together, it can look, I don't think it's messy. It's just making sure it gives a consistent picture, that we are monitoring and that we're keeping an eye on as it progresses. In terms of the industrial strategy, so just going back to that, I think what businesses want and what everybody said is that consistency of both strategy and policy. So whether it's R&D tax credits, whatever the policy is, it needs to be consistent. On the industrial strategy, I was really excited to see the industrial strategy because I think, well, for lots of reasons, but I think the growth-driving sectors are really interesting. They're much broader than we've seen in the past. So the inclusion of the service sectors, like the financial services, the inclusion of professional and business services, that's really interesting. So in terms of that journey, what I would say, and it brings back some of the points in the other panel, is we absolutely need to not just think about tech. So tech's super important, but things like economics, social sciences, all those things that align with these big growth-driving sectors is really important. And also having that underpinning research to feed in to those drivers. On skills, again, this is probably the biggest issue that comes up from our members, and I would agree with everything that you said. I just want to go back to a point that was made into quite a small point, but I don't think it's a small point. I think it's an enormous point. It's about visas and visa costs. I just want to give you one example, because this makes me feel sad that we're in this situation, is a family of 4 coming to the UK on a global talent visa. So if you're coming, you're somebody who's potentially very good coming from another country to the UK, you might have 2 young children. Up front, this is up front, you're paying over £20,000 to come into the UK. And the Royal Society did some work, and this is the lowest figure, but if we compare to the international average, the global talent visa costs for the UK, and this is the lower end because it's including the UK figure, we are 719% higher than the international average. So if we want to bring, whether it's businesses or we need to make it, it's not just a narrative, it is the money as well, because that is not a cost I'd want to be paying, however much I wanted a job. So we do need to take that into consideration. But I agree with, I think all those points are correct and good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those points. So I'm now going to bring in Tom.
Yeah, so I think obviously one of the big implications of the budget is employer NICS contributions. Obviously when you're seeing increases with minimum wage for staff who might be supporting R&D too, what is the potential impact and how is that going to change R&D intensive business?
I can take that. Look, like our our companies ultimately are mostly loss-making until they scale, right? So they raise investment, usually through venture capital, and then they build their businesses, and they're burning through that cash as they go. And ultimately, when you increase the costs on business, and increase the costs of hiring in this case, and retaining staff, that runway becomes shorter because they're spending more money on paying the NICs. And so, I had the text from our founders on budget day being like, that's cost me, 200, 300, 400,000 pounds. And it means that they have to then raise investment quicker, potentially. They have to sort of understand that it changes the life cycle of their business materially. So yeah, look, it's a cost to bear. I think that the strange thing about working with entrepreneurs sometimes is that they ultimately feel like government policy just kind of happens to them. If we're honest, like they've got so many difficulties in running their business that sometimes, when you ask them, okay, well, what is the, how much will this impact you? They'll be like, oh, well, it'll cost our business this much time and this much money, but we'll just have to get on with it. And I think the thing is, like, our job ultimately, and I'd hope the job of policymakers as best possible within obviously all the balances people try and make, is we have to make it as easy as possible to build their business. But yeah, so look, it hurts. I think that one of the other things that I touched on in the start, but I think is really material actually, particularly for our companies, is around capital gains tax, where what you see is this challenge of how do you incentivize employees into these early stage, very risky technology businesses. And one of the core ways you do that is through providing them with share options that will ultimately turn into equity in the business. And I have to say, like, one of the things that upset a bunch of founders was when the Prime Minister was talking about his definition of working people and said that people who own shares don't count as working people. And I understood what he was trying to say, and, everyone here in politics and appreciates the balance, and it's, when you're in that kind of box being talked to by a journalist, it's always tricky. But obviously, a huge number of the employees of our businesses are compensated in that way, and it's an important part of their compensation. And crucially, it's what makes them go and work for a British tech company that is scaling, as opposed to taking a higher base salary to go work at Google, right? And I think that how do we really kind of tell the story to those kind of people that we want them to go and do that, and how do we tell the story to entrepreneurs, whether it's on Nix or something else, that despite these potential additional barriers, we still want them to build their businesses here and scale them here.
Thank you.
I have a go at some of this. In terms of manufacturing, if you look at the SME community in particular, one of the challenges in manufacturing is that they're often locked into the supply chain. They're often on 12-month fixed contracts. There's not much opportunity to raise prices. You're talking about an average of about £1,000 an employee in additional cost from what came through the budget. A lot of those operations are kind of break-even or very low margins. And for them, I worry about how they're going to cope with it, to be honest with you. One of the reactions will be cutting back on some of their R&D, obviously not employing as many people as they could have done. So we've yet to see the data, so we do survey, and over the next couple of months we'll have some really hard data we can publish around what actions people are going to take to mitigate the cost. But it's that community of people locked into the supply chain that I'm more concerned about, I would say, at this stage.
And are you aware of anyone already taking steps, like looking at sort of not extending contracts?
Well, they're all talking about it. So they're thinking about, if you've got 400 people, it's £400,000, and if you're a break-even business, that's a lot to find. So do we scale back on what we were spending on R&D? Do we employ less people? They're all going through that decision-making process as we speak. But I think the dust will settle in the next couple of weeks or so, and we've been able to have some good data around, which we'll publish, which will show what people's reaction to this is going to be.
Just got a brief point. We've not seen the impact either, and again, I just talk about the whole supply chain and everyone involved, including the universities, and because it's going to affect all parts of that ecosystem. I just wanted to build up on a point that Dom said that's a more general point, is it's a real challenge to hear the voice of SMEs.
Yes.
And I think that's something I would be thinking about on this committee, and we all need to be thinking about, and you do it as your day job, but how do you get that voice? Because they're really busy, they're trying to save money, it's quite hard to get that voice. So I do think we need to be working as a whole community, and when we're thinking about R&D is how do we make sure the SME voice is heard when we're developing priorities or policies or anything collectively.
That's absolutely right. And given the government's commitment to growth and the role of startups and scale-ups in driving that growth, we need to hear the voice, and we also need to understand the impact of policy measures on that. Because I think, Dom, just at some of the points that you were making, we need to be seeing more startups, more scale-ups. We need to be encouraging founders from diverse backgrounds, and whether if they want to be called working people, I'm sure we agree that they are working very hard. We need to be rewarding them in a way that makes the most, gives the greatest incentives, and also makes the most sense economically for the long term as well. Shall we? I think now I'm going to go to Steve.
Yep.
Yes.
Right, thanks very much. Just turning to sort of future commitments of the government, your assessment there. What do you think are the long-term ambitions for R&D investment, and are there any particular areas you think need to be prioritised over the sort of longer term?
So me first, and probably I'm going to support a little bit of what Dom's brief is here, but a really important thing we need to change in this country is the ability to scale up a lot of the innovation that we've got. We track quite a lot of startup companies that end up at the moment going off to the United States or being bought by American PE or venture capital companies and being moved to the US under the Inflation Reduction Act and taking advantage of scale-up capital there. Welcome the Chancellor's comments on pension fund reform, freeing up pension funds to help us with this scale-up challenge. But in the longer term, that's really something we do have to solve. It's been with us for a long time. We are definitely the most innovative country in the world when it comes to advanced manufacturing, which is why we're regularly in the top 10 in the world. And there's so many opportunities right now around the net zero agenda with the technologies that are coming out. We don't want to lose those to other countries which are offering greater incentives for scaling up. So scaling up for the longer term, trying to solve that problem, and the efforts the Chancellor's making around that, really, really important, I think, for the long term.
Could you just clarify? You said that we are definitely the most innovative country in the world when it comes to manufacturing. I wasn't aware of that.
We are. We've got, I can give you lists of where we're world leaders in different technologies. And I can tell you, I did a very interesting round table with our counterparts in America recently, when we had a group of very senior chief executives around the table, and their comment to me was, you have all the ideas in the United Kingdom. We're so jealous of your innovation structure. We don't have anything like that in the United States. We've got all the money, so we take your ideas and we scale them up.
Can I just come? So what are the particular things that create that environment in Britain versus the US?
I think we've got a culture of it, to be honest with you. I think one of the reflections is that the United Kingdom hasn't had a lot of money, so we actually end up being very innovative as a result. And engineers in particular are quite clever at finding ways without much money to actually be world leading. But
can you give us more money?
There's a bit of that. But if we had more money, we could amplify it. Exactly.
Well, if we had more money in the right way and in the right places. That's fantastic. So,
so the top point I had was the same, was the scale-up point. Yeah. So other points to add to that, with scale-up, that being the top one, is access to infrastructure. So we talked about this in the morning. There's a big requirement from the businesses we speak to about specialised space for early stage businesses that require a larger space as they grow and scale up, and also for the final stages of product development when they want to take their product ahead. And we find that some SMEs are working or moving abroad. Again, the same issue. We're having people leaving. So the changes in planning regulation might help with that. The other point is around regulation, and we know we've made some really positive steps around that, but we could be really innovative in the way that we think about regulation. We have some brilliant examples, particularly from the financial sector, around these regulation sandboxes. I don't know where they can test regulation on a small scale, and we have heard from businesses that would be brilliant to do more of that, reducing the risk to innovators. And then the final one, I don't know if this is okay to say this here, but is around really bureaucracy and sort of the culture of risk or lack of culture of risk within the public sector. So that could be around procurement, it could be around civil servants making decisions and really encouraging a more innovative culture within the public sector. And we've heard that across the board from businesses, but also from academia as well. So I think the drive of DSIT becoming sort of the AI centre of government is definitely a step in the right direction. But I think there's a lot more we could do there.
Okay, that's interesting. I think that, obviously the consequences of failure in the public sector are different from the consequences of failure in the private sector. So we need to understand what a changing risk type would mean and how we can drive that through DCIT in a way which which
you're not wasting money, and also I think
wasting money is a very good point.
Yeah, and procuring. I think like in government businesses where you can procure that cutting edge innovation is also a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And despite the fact that there's less risk appetite, if you like, in the public sector, we nevertheless manage to fail in procurement in pretty spectacular ways on occasion. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Dom. And then
yeah. So I think it's worth kind of reflecting on how much progress we've made in the past 10 years before we kind of move on to the next 10. So, in 2014, we raised less venture capital for technology companies in the UK than we did in May this year. So, the amount of progress we've made in terms of the growth of this ecosystem is absolutely massive. We're the third largest venture capital-backed technology ecosystem in the world, behind the US and China. And so that kind of growth of this ecosystem and the funding that's gone into it has really improved. There's been a few different challenges. The first is that, as sort of Stephen briefly mentioned, getting that scale-up capital, not just for companies, because actually as you scale, quite often you can raise the capital, you're just not raising it from British firms, so you're often going to the US to raise the capital. But even sometimes if you are raising it from British firms, the beneficiaries of that, from the kind of pension funds that are putting the money into the venture capital firms, are not British LPs, as they're called, limited partners. So the real beneficiaries of the tech boom in the past decade in the United Kingdom have not been, my grandma's pension. It's actually been teachers in Ontario, because the Canadian teachers' funds have been the ones putting the money in. And so that kind of material changed the way in which we think about the institutional investor infrastructure and the pension fund infrastructure to deploy capital into this space is really, really important. So that's kind of the funding side of this. I think that the other sort of funding side of this is the public R&D funding, where, as has been mentioned, and I think greeted happily by all of us here, we've seen this commitment to this for the long run. But I would say that I think that this sort of continuous funding, which has increased significantly over the past decade, now has to be sort of joined with a close look at the institutions and whether they're really delivering what we want them to deliver.
Absolutely.
Because in reality, the running joke in the sector is that 8 out of 10 startups have a bad opinion of Innovate UK, and the other 2 took money from them and still have a bad opinion of Innovate UK. And now, obviously, to some extent, bidding for public funding is always going to be challenging. There's always going to be a journey, and that's right and proper. But actually, the experience of companies, the experience of entrepreneurs in effectively leveraging some of the money that is designed for them to be supporting their R&D and hopefully boosting their businesses, and that journey from public support for the R&D process and hopefully commercialization into private funding for these businesses can then scale and grow them globally, there's a bridge to be built there that hasn't been there. And so I think there's sort of those really significant challenges to how do we make sure that the money is deployed really effectively through reformed institutions that can work really closely with the successful private sector that we've built.
I'll bring Steve back in briefly, and then we'll go to Adam.
I think that's a really, really interesting conundrum that we've got, and I think the other aspects of this is the access to private capital in the regions as well. So I think my region, the Southwest, gets about 2.7% of all private investment in the country. The vast majority of it obviously sucked up by London and the greater southeast. So I think it'd be great to hear more maybe in the future on sort of what we can do as a country to get that private investment and into scale-ups working better, I think, for the whole country.
The whole country.
So we don't miss the opportunities that are present elsewhere. But also it'd be great to get just a very quick feedback on your view on the role of universities, spin-outs. There's been quite a big debate over the years about sort of the heavy hand of universities and spin-outs that hasn't been particularly helpful, I think, in building the sort of sector. So any views you have on that would be really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on. First of all, on the regional point, completely agree. I think we see this as a few different challenges. So we built this really successful ecosystem, like I said, that's deploying more capital now than it almost ever has before, and we're building much better businesses. But that capital is obviously not spread equally. So if you're building a business outside London in the kind of Golden Triangle, it's more challenging. If you're a female founder, it's way more challenging. We all know that the stats there are absolutely horrible. If you're an ethnic minority founder, it's more difficult. If you're a working class founder, it's more difficult, right? And so those 4 challenges that we see as core to this is like, how do we address that and make sure that there's more equal access to the funding to build your business? When it comes to the spin-outs, I mean, look, like, this has been a consistent problem for a long time, and actually it's about what we seem to have had over the past few years is this sort of battle between private sector investors on the one hand who say, universities should take a much lower stake in order for us to make the businesses more investable. You have universities, although more accurately, it's not necessarily the Vice-Chancellors, it's actually the tech transfer offices, on the other hand, saying, we think this is really important, we actually quite like our 20%, thank you very much. And the reality is you've got startup founders stuck in the middle who are having a pretty crappy experience. And so the question is, how do we address that? I think there was a lot of useful information that came out of the spin-outs review that was conducted. I think, if I'm honest, it would have been better if it wasn't conducted by people from Oxford and Cambridge, not because they're not great institutions, but because they are outliers in this discussion almost obviously. But what I would say is that not enough of that's been taken forward yet, and crucially, that there's going to be a journey, much like with some of the pension fund conversations, not just of saying that we want things to change, but to some extent of dragging, especially the tech transfer offices, kicking and screaming towards change. And I think that now, in a sort of slightly different attitude of funding environment to R&D and universities than we've had over the past decade, where it's felt a little bit Punch and Judy with the universities and the government, whereas I don't think it's going to be like that going forward, there's a better chance to say, look, yes, we're going to look at the way in which R&D funding works in universities and provide you more funding in order to change your policies in these areas to make your businesses more investable. Because ultimately that's a benefit to both sides. The reason why these TTOs are clinging on to this high equity stake that damages the businesses in the long run is because they're trying to protect their bottom line in a way that actually isn't beneficial to the whole pie. And actually there's a really easy trade-off of being like, how do we provide more support for the kind of research that the universities want to do in order that we have better policies that can build better businesses out of spin-outs.
That's a very good point, Dom. I'm going to, and I should say that during this discussion, we should all make clear if you think there are particular areas that this committee should look at in more detail later on in our programme. I'm going to bring in Adam now.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, and firstly, just to agree very strongly with the comment, Stephen, you made a few minutes ago about the UK being at the very forefront of manufacturing innovation. As a former manufacturing researcher in my previous job, I'd very strongly like to agree with that.
At the forefront.
Yes, excellent. No, thank you, Stephen. And I mean, my constituency in the East Midlands, right? And the East Midlands is very much in our manufacturing heartland in terms of both SMEs and right up to big multinationals. But there's always been a large inequality in fact, Dom, you touched on this a minute ago, inequality in regional investment. And what I'd like to know is, what are your sort of collective experiences and understanding of regional investment requirements, and how can we ensure that the various regions around the UK get the investment that they need?
So let me start thinking about that. So basically, what we're seeing is a significant change going on right now. The Midlands is a very good example of this, where clustering is becoming really important. So we see that whether it's Bristol around the aerospace clusters that are happening there, with some of the most advanced technologies in aerospace in the world that are coming out of that area, or Teesside on the net zero agenda, what's going on there now, absolutely astonishing investments and innovation happening. And we are starting to see that attract that investment into that area. I think the new investment zone in the centre of Birmingham is going to be, European-wide, one of the biggest that's there. And I think that's going to attract a lot of investment we've not seen before. We're also seeing, to join up the other dot around the universities, them leaning into this idea of clustering and regional development that's happening. And a lot more what we call OT coming out of universities, operational technology, rather than just pure research. So a lot of those universities now thinking about the processes you use in the new environment to do the production, rather than just the core R&D side of it. So that combination of universities, the local clustering that's happening, a lot of it under the mayors, which is very interesting, is starting to attract in. Talking to the banks, they've got now regional people that are focused on where those regional developments are going to happen. So this is a great, I think, development to watch very carefully over the next few years.
Thank you, Stephen. That's very positive response.
Yeah, as you know, we represent all different parts of the sector, and the consistent messages that comes from, whether we speak to universities, whether we're speaking small business, big business, charities, anything, everybody, including the public, by the way, which is really important, sees the value of regional innovation and sees the value of all those different parts of the ecosystem working together to benefit the community, to link up skills. We've talked about skills, bring money and jobs into local communities. And I think what the challenge is going to be, we obviously need a national strategy. We've got national strategies. It's how do you link up the regional needs with the national needs? And what's come very strongly from our discussions is that we need freedom within those regional contexts with decision makers on how they spend money. But the question came up before, how do you link that national strategy and funding with the local and making sure that that's done in a quality way, because we've got these structures already in lots of parts of the system. So again, we think it's a very exciting opportunity. And just to link to the skills agenda as well, is linking local business needs for skills with providers like universities. We don't do enough of that, and there's a massive opportunity to do that. Also promoting what R&D is happening in the region and bringing skills in that way. So we feel this is a very, very big opportunity for the next review and the future of R&D.
Just on that, very quickly, a specific question, which perhaps I should have asked the previous panel, was the previous government had a commitment to increasing the R&D spend outside of the Greater South East by 40% over a time period I can't quite remember. Would you recommend that this government continue with that commitment?
What? Sorry.
I was going to say, in the framework of a recast industrial strategy, would be the answer to that question. It takes into account these regional focus clusters that we've got and the development of net zero technologies or aerospace or whatever else we've got in the industrial strategy when we get to the point around the spending review, when we do publish that, and we're inputting into that now. But it's got to be in that framework, I think, supporting that framework.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think what we need to be thinking about is building capability. We heard this in the first panel, because what happens is you get high performers. I mean, it's natural. Then they receive funding, they receive investment, and then it reiterates and reiterates. So then you end up with like the golden triangle. So we need to think very carefully about how we build that, and its capacity is different from how we currently invest or direct funding. But I also think we do need to have a national strategy. We've got to be careful how we do that so we don't waste money.
Okay, I'm going to bring Emily in briefly now, and we're into the last sort of 10 minutes, and then we'll go to Lauren.
Just a quick kind of follow-up. So Milton Keynes, technically in the Golden Triangle, but not considered necessarily in that, and that has had the local leadership has played a huge role in creating the 5th biggest GVA now in the country. So, that's mayors and local leaders. Yeah. What do you think the government's role is in creating and supporting clusters, very specifically?
So I can come in on that.
Yes.
Like, I think there's two things. So and actually Milton Keynes is a really good example. So the first thing to say when you come to sort of venture-backed technology companies is that we're actually really good compared to other European economies at building them outside of our capital. So it's like actually an unusual story in the relation. Usually we always say, how do we get kind of regional growth in the United Kingdom? Although being from Leeds, I always hate the word regional. That implies that it's regional to where, frankly, like you're yourself. But the reality, well, quite. But so I think that, and in the case of the BBB, what you have is a lot of kind of local investment funds that are then deployed in certain regions. Now, actually, the Southeast, including Milton Keynes, currently isn't covered by the BBB in a way that is really silly, because actually, if you're in Milton Keynes, you're not in London, right? It's just like so actually, that's quite an obvious example of something that can be addressed quite simply. But really, it's sort of working in partnership with some of the really successful work that's being done locally. So one of the things that we've seen work pretty well is kind of what we call co-investment funds, where you have local leadership, and the first one was in London, the London Co-Investment Fund, but there's also something really interesting going on in Liverpool that Steve Rotherham's building, that takes kind of local investment and twins it with investment from local institutions. But obviously, looking at the amount of money that is in local government at the moment, it's not great, right? As in the reality is, and the ability of government to support that through the BBB or through other institutions would make total sense. And so really, it's kind of building programs that sort of take a look at what's working locally and support it and lift it upwards, as opposed to what we often see, which is kind of relatively top-down government programs that say, we're going to come in and tell you how to do innovation locally. And what we find is if you're, people building the ecosystems in these places, and there are really successful people doing that building, you think, well, that's lovely, but you've just sent me two civil servants from the government to tell me how to do my job. I don't think so. And actually, like, I think there's sort of an obvious way of saying, okay, how do we find the people doing great stuff locally and support what they're doing and put money into the schemes that are being effective in these different places?
Yes, building on what is there.
Absolutely.
Now, so I'm going to go to Lauren now because we're getting to the last few minutes. Sorry, Alicia.
No, it's fine. I've written it down.
Thank you. And actually, some of my questions kind of build on when the discussion that we're having at the moment about access and opportunity and skills. And I think the regional sector is very interesting. But actually, how do we? And I think Dom, you mentioned it about the working class, about women, about how is it that we can break down those barriers and access to curriculum and skills employment in place. Yeah. How do we answer that?
Yeah, so I'd sort of start by saying one of the big problems for tech and these kind of businesses is that if you're a teacher, as both my parents taught in high schools, and the reality is you haven't got a clue what these jobs are. Like, and so the starting point is like, how do you even show people when they're at the schools that this is possible, right? And then you get into the skills system as supported by the government, and sort of a mild anecdote is we did a lot of work on the previous government's Kickstart scheme, which was supposed to support people, young people at risk of long-term unemployment into jobs, and it would sort of funnel them through. And we had 250 companies across our community who were willing to take these people on, and the government was providing incentives to do so. And the job centres and DWP scheme didn't even know how to describe the jobs that these companies were offering. And crucially, and I think this is really important for understanding how to spread this opportunity, even though a lot of these jobs were available to be done wherever in the country, because these are tech companies, you don't have to sit in an office necessarily. The whole system was built on the idea that you went into your local job centre and then you found a local employer who was going to hire you, which meant that if you were the 100 kids in the Shoreditch job centre, you were doing great. But actually, that's not super helpful, right? And it's actually not a rational way for companies to hire either. And so I think the starting point has to be there. It's like, how do you really kind of tell the story of what these businesses are even doing and get them involved earlier on? And I think what you find with entrepreneurs in particular is an absolute willingness to do that. It's just linking them with that system.
That's great. I think that's something we can feed into the DWP review of job centres, which is ongoing at the moment. Thank you.
I had a little point about diversity, just because I feel so passionately about this, and I think we know, I'm sure you've got all this information, that we know that if you have a diverse exec teams in companies, they outperform financially. We know that we can boost GDP and the economic growth by being more diverse and having inclusive practices. But to be really frank, we're not doing very well. So like you said there's horrible stats. I've got here all female founder teams receive less than 3% of UK VC funding. And that hasn't changed for a long time. That's absolutely shocking. It's totally unacceptable. Our angel investors, only 14% of them are women. And then there's so many other areas we could look at: ethnicity, social position, and all of those things. And I think diversity is seen as an add-on, and it cannot be. If you even just look at the economic importance of this, and I've not seen big changes happening, and I think we need to see this as a priority for the economy, not just something that women are moaning about, basically. So I think one of the things, well, you were saying publishing incentives, right? So how do we incentivise things? A lot of that's by money, or it could be by tax. How do we ensure that we're really transparent with information and we're looking at that properly, and when we're looking about how we invest money, it's not just who receives it, it's who's making those decisions.
Yes.
Because we really don't look at that very much. So I would say my overriding message in this is we need to take this seriously. It's not an add-on. It's fundamental to the future of the UK.
I think you'll find the committee is very much of that view as well. And it's also reflecting the increasing presence of technology in all our lives and in every sector of society and in every sector of business. Then the need to have that diversity of skills is an essential. I think, Stephen, I think you wanted to bring briefly.
Point.
Yes.
Just to give you a positive example of things that are happening. So in engineering, it's been a challenge around gender, for example. If you look at apprentice starts, around 20% female is the average that's going on. A lot of that's back down to STEM education. It's a maths-hungry profession. You need to do maths if you want to be an engineer. One thing that's really worked well over the last 5 years, which has been funded by DFE, has been the university technical colleges, where they start at 13 and 14, take them from schools, and that is another school effectively, but with a heavy bias on technical education and maths. And there you've got now 50% of them, well, 85% going on to do apprenticeships, and 50% of them female, which is really impressive. We've only got 44. If you asked any of the big names in manufacturing that you know and love, they would say, please, please, please fund more of these UTCs.
That's okay.
Let's get the kids started early. Let's get them on these vocational skills early. That's a great way of trying to address that challenge. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We covered our last 5 minutes, and I'm very keen to come on to a specific example, I think, of an opportunity for this government, and to understand what you think are the barriers or the challenges or the opportunities associated with it. It will also give you the opportunity to make your sort of closing statements as well. And a specific example, and this is something that the committee, as the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee, now, as Josh said earlier, now has the digital government and has come into the department. The government is committed to digital transformation of government, the benefits that it will bring to the general public, the benefits that it will bring in terms of productivity, in terms of personalisation, etc. That is a tremendous opportunity for business in this country as well, and particularly, I would hope, small businesses. So do you have any views on how the government can ensure that this is a successful opportunity for research-intensive businesses, and perhaps what the committee could do to support that, and then any other statements that you would like to make as well?
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in on that. I think that the use of sort of technology in the public sector is absolutely critical here. The opportunity is massive, both for the UK in fixing its challenging public services environment. I think anyone who's used public services recently knows that. But also because the companies that we're building here are the kind of people who can be fixing these problems. So a super practical example that was in the paper, actually in The Independent yesterday, is one of the companies that we've worked with a little bit called Tortoise, who what they do is they allow work with doctors, and it allows them to sort of clinically automate their clinical notes from appointments. So straight away you have all the notes from your appointment there, as in when you've sort of done a video appointment, and it means that they don't have to spend 10 minutes typing it up. And it's just a super practical example, not of, obviously there are sort of more sexy versions of medical technologies that might help with diagnostics and things like that, but it's a super practical example of this is a burden for clinicians, and how do we fix that problem with technology? So super, super practical things. In order to address these problems, we have to fix procurement, right? And this is where the point at which everyone on the committee goes to sleep, because it's hugely challenging and frankly, quite dull. But in reality, what we have is this sort of version of death by pilot, where you might get into one part of the NHS or one part of the public sector, and then you'll be, as a small business, you'll be like, great, I built this amazing thing, it's worked really well in this area. Then you go to, the next NHS trust or a different part of the public sector, and they say, well, that's great, so we'll start again from the ground floor, and we'll have these conversations again. And they'll be like, but we just did all this work over here, and it's worked really well. And they'll be like, no, we're really sorry, we've got to start. And look, that's hugely challenging, and for small businesses is absolutely killer. Really we need to address a lot, and we've got a lot of work on sort of fixing the procurement challenges. The other kind of real opportunity that I think we haven't much touched on here, but is crucial, is in AI, right? Where, we did a big report last year that said there were sort of 1,700 AI businesses in the UK. That's now way over 2,000. The government is really thinking about this quite deeply, both in the public sector context, where it's going to be critical because of examples like the one I just talked about, but also outside, and the opportunity for us to sort of grow our economy leveraging these opportunities. But right now we're behind on some of the core things that we talked about, whether it's fixing the compute challenges and making sure that people have access to the compute they need, whether it's understanding the data environment, both through the data bill, through the National Data Library, but basically getting people access to the data they need in a safe, secure and sensible way. And then, being able to build the funding environment, which we talked about as well, for building those kind of businesses. And if we don't win that race, then it's going to be a hugely challenging environment for us. So, the opportunity is really clear, both in fixing some of the public service challenges, but also growing our economy. But in order to do that, we have to build on the base that we have there.
Fantastic. I would ask if Alicia or Stephen have 1 minute contributions they would like to make.
No, you go first.
So Dom's talking about us almost giving these small businesses an opportunity and using that brilliant innovation that we have in the UK, which is, I agree with everything you've said. In the other direction, we then have data that is better shared and better understood across the public sector. That is the most fabulous resource for researchers and innovators. So let's find ways to have access to that data and to protect it and regulate it in a way that we can use it for brilliant research. Just in terms of really quick closing remarks, the sort of consistency and sustained strategy and policy are brilliant for the sector. Please keep it up and review it and involve us. Second is the long-term investment and support. I will send on a document that we've done about 10-year investments, because it all sounds great. What about the actual practical delivery of that, which we've done quite a bit of work on? And I think it's really important, like, how do you stop things, how do you start things, how do you keep it innovative? And then the last one is listening is really important, listening to diverse groups, listening to the R&D community, but really importantly, the public. And we're doing a lot of work on that. I'm very, very happy to share our sort of civic engagement.
Yes, and listening to the public is a focus for this committee, and
We'd
something
love
we'll
to
be doing
do
more
it.
engagement on. Stephen,
Right, just quickly then, three big things for me which are really important. Digital adoption. I mentioned about Made Smarter, but the 5,000 or so businesses that have been through this show, massive productivity gains, big energy efficiency gains. We've got a long way to go. We've got hundreds of thousands of businesses to digitise. So really focusing on all the support that goes around that. There's the theme of localisation nowadays. So with the geopolitical situation and the change in supply chains, most large companies are looking at their localisation rate. That's an opportunity for this country. That's bringing more stuff back here to make in the UK. To do that, we need to support it with advanced materials and all the other R&D work that goes with that, and show there's a joined-up strategy for it. The transition to a net zero economy is going to create, we think, a very big opportunity to grow from 10% of GDP as manufacturing to about 15% of GDP. There's about £140 billion, we think, of opportunity there in different manufacturing technologies, and we need to make sure that that's uppermost as a priority for us. But I think in summary, whenever you have the Secretary of State here to the committee or anyone else from the department, number one question for me is going to be skills. How are we going to fill this skills gap? With all these great opportunities, and every time we announce another investment with another 10,000 jobs, where are they going to come from? Are we joined up? Do we have a proper skills policy in this country to generate the skills we need for the future? I think that's absolutely vital.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a fantastic note to end on. And thank you so much for your time. It's been an excellent discussion and debate. And order.